Okay, so the next topic is now process costing with work in process. What we have done that we have made our process account with normal loss, with abnormal loss and with abnormal gain. But we believe that all of the input, whatever material we made input, all of that was converted into the finished goods with no work in process. But in reality what happens that if you start work on say 100 units, you have finished 60 or 70 units, and then there are always 20, 30 or 40 units which are in work in process. And work in process means those units which are not completely finished but they are partly finished. So we need to calculate the cost of work in process. So what is the value of work done on these incomplete units? So let's see it with another example. So if you remember, we have got the same formula. Cost per unit is input cost minus scrap value of normal loss divided by input units minus normal loss units. But what if units are not finished? Which means that here we assumed that all of the units were finished. We got good output. But now we will say that some units are in good output and some units are incomplete units. You may have one full shirt and one half shirt. So this is your finished unit and this is your work in process unit. So they both do not have the same value. The cost of this unit or the value of this unit definitely is more than this one. So we cannot give them the same value. We go for equivalent units. What is equivalent unit? So I'm not saying finished unit, I'm saying equivalent unit. Equivalent unit means that if you've got two units with 50% one work done, it is called one equivalent unit. Like two half units are equal to one full unit. Similarly, if I tell you that you have 10 units in work in process and these 10 units are 60% finished. So you can say that although in counting these are 10 units, but because they are 60% finished, so you can say that you have 6 equivalent units, 10 multiplied by 60%. Similarly, if you have got 100 units in work in process and these 100 units are 70% complete, so you can say that you have 70 equivalent units. So equivalent unit, it is not like a full unit, it is like a conversion. That 100 units, if they are 70% finished, so you can say that you have 70 equivalent units, which means that the value of these 100 units which are incomplete is equal to the value of 70 finished units. Half unit plus half unit is one equivalent whole unit. And you have to find out cost per equivalent unit. So when we calculate the cost of work in process, we don't talk about units, we talk about equivalent units. So let's create one example. We say the method is the same, units first. So you've got input and then it is equal to normal loss, good output, abnormal gain, and closing work in process. This is something we are adding new. It was not in the previous example. So in this example, you have 1500 units of input and there is a 10% normal loss, which means 150 units are in normal loss. You get output and then you've got abnormal loss gain and you've got closing work in process. So in this example, we are assuming that abnormal loss or gain is 0. So you will have normal loss, good output and closing work in process. So if you have 1300 good output, then 50 units are in closing work in process. If you make a total of these three, they will become 1500. So these 50 units are we need to, calculate the value for. So we make our process account. We say the raw materials for 1500 units is 12,975. I'm just assuming some data. Then you've got labor, which is 9,576, and then overheads 3156. So your total cost is now converted into output, normal loss, and closing work in process. So always fill in the units first. So we write down like this, which we just saw in the previous slide, that 1300 units of good output, 150 in the normal loss and 50 in the closing work in process. So 1500 units Normal loss, let's suppose, again I am assuming it that your normal loss has a scrap value of $1 per unit. So it means that the value of normal loss is $150. And now we need to calculate the value for good output and for closing work in process. So your total cost is 25,707. And if you remember from previous lecture video, how do we calculate that? So finished output is 1300. Material for these three, so for 1300 units are 100% complete with respect to material. So we call it statement of equivalent units. So these 1300 units are fully finished units. So they are 100% complete with respect to material, 100% complete with respect to labor and overhead. So you can say that these 1300 units, there are equivalent units of material 1300, labor 1300, overhead 1300. And then you've got normal loss 150 units, and you don't assign anything because these are the lost units. You just put 0 value, and then you need to calculate your closing work in process, which is 50 units. Now these 50 units are not fully finished. So in question they will give you this data that within these 50 units material is 100% finished, which means that whatever material is needed, you already have given that material. Probably some part of labor is remaining, and that makes it incomplete, but material has been fully given. So 50 units, if they are 100% complete with respect to material, so you can say that you've got 50 equivalent units of material. Labor is only 60% done because we need some more time to work on that. So now 50 multiplied by 60%, it means that 30 equivalent units. Although these are 50 units, but with respect to labor, you can say that only 30 equivalent units these will be considered, and overheads are only done as 30%. So 50 multiplied by 30%, it gives you 15 units. So what you assume that now you have got 1,350 units with respect to material, 1,300 units with respect to labor, and 1,315 with respect to overhead. Please do not add them. These are not separate units. You cannot say 1,350 plus 1,300 plus 1,300. These are not 4,000 units. These are the same 1,500 units. But we say that with the 1,500 total units of input, what is my output is material with respect to 1,350 units are completed with respect to material. For labor, we've got 1,330 units, equivalent units with respect to labor, and 1,315 units are completed with respect to overheads. So now these are my equivalent units. We call it statement of equivalent units. And then we calculate cost per equivalent unit. We need to calculate cost per equivalent unit. So we've got material, labor and overhead. So our cost for material, labor, overhead was given in question 12,000, 9,000 and 3,000. And we divide it with less the scrap value. And first we need to minus the scrap value was material. So scrap value of normal loss. If you remember 150 units multiplied by $1. So your scrap value of normal loss was $150. But this way you will always subtract with respect to material because you sold it out. So you don't subtract it from labor or overhead. So you got 12,975 in material. This was your cost. And when you sell some normal loss units, you decrease the cost of material. So now your true cost of material is 12,825. Now these are my three costs now. And then I will divide them with my equivalent unit, which means that after spending $12,825 on material, you get 1,350 equivalent units of material. After spending 9,576 on labor, you get 1,330 equivalent units of labor. And similarly, you will write down for the overheads. And now you find out cost per equivalent unit. So your cost per equivalent unit is 9.50 because you just simply divided both of them, and 7.20 and 2.40. So your cost per equivalent unit is 19.10. You add it. So we are not calculating here cost for a finished good, we are calculating what is my cost per equivalent unit, and that is $19.10. Now we go for finished output. So how do you measure your finished output? You've got 1300 units because 1300 units were completed with respect to material, labor and overhead. So you multiply them with 19.10. It gives you 24,830. Then you've got closing work in process. Your closing work in process were 50 material units. You remember 50 units were 100% complete with respect to material, and the cost of one equivalent unit of material was 9.50. And with respect to labor, you had only 30 equivalent units, and one equivalent unit for labor is 7.20. So you multiply it and you get $216. And then with respect to overhead, we've got 15 overhead equivalent units at the $2.40. So you multiplied by 15 into 2.40, it is $36. So my value of closing work in process is $727. So we've got finished output value based on 1300 equivalent units, 24,000, and the value of 50 work in process units. What is the value of work in process? That is $727. So now you complete your process account, you go back there and you just fill in the numbers. You've got 1,300 units of output, which is 24,830, and closing work in process is 727. When you will make a total, these two numbers will be equal. This is how you calculate your closing work in process. You calculated here 3 steps. Number 1, you made your statement of equivalent units. So you converted your finished units or work in process into number of equivalent units. You call it statement of equivalent units. Second step was we calculated cost per equivalent unit, and third step was that we calculated the cost of finished output and the cost of your work in process. Very simple, just make statement of equivalent unit. It may look a little bit complex, but what you need to do that you need to remember the format. Once you remember the format, then you just have to fill in the numbers. So format you should keep in your mind. After learning the format, then you just put in the numbers step by step. So in previous example, we just saw one closing work in process. And now we are going to do one more example in which we will have opening work in process as well as closing work in process. So 2 work in process we will consider in this example. So we say the method is the same, units first. You have got inputs, then normal loss, good output, then abnormal loss or gain, then you have a closing work in process. And here you also have opening work in process this time. So you had opening work in process and then you made some inputs, and as a result you have good output, normal loss, abnormal loss, gain, and closing work in process. So what we say in this example, that we already have 50 units in our opening work in process. Just like in, what happens that you do production in multiple stages, or in multiple periods. So you've got 50 units as in your opening work in process, and then you add, this is your closing work in process from previous period. If you remember, like $727 worth of closing work in process from the last month. And now we come up to the next period. The last month closing work in process, it becomes the opening work in process for the next month, and then you added 2050 and then you added 2050 units in input, and you have a normal loss of 10% of this input, which is 205 units. This is 10% of material input only. And then you've got good output of 2015 units, and you've got 80 units remaining as your closing work in process, and we assume that our abnormal loss units are 200. And we assume that our abnormal gain is 200 units, because if you notice that when you have 2050 units of input, and if you take a normal loss of 10%, you should be getting something like 1800 something units, but you are getting more output. You are getting 2000 output, so it means that there is an abnormal gain. So process accounting, we create our process accounting, and we have opening work in process 50 units. Then the value of those 50 units was $727. Then you have got raw materials in this next stage, which is for 2050 units you added 22,000 worth of raw material. Then you had labor cost, then you've got overhead cost, and on the other side of the ledger what you've got an output of normal loss and abnormal gain, because if you remember from previous lecture, abnormal gain, it comes on the debit side of the process account, abnormal loss appears on the credit side. And you have closing work in process. So always fill in the units first. So what we have, output is 2015 units, normal loss was 205 units, and your abnormal gain is 200 units, which will appear on the debit side. And you've got here the closing work in process of 80 units. So when you match them, they become equal. So the first step is always that you match your units. And now normal loss, from previous example we said that our normal loss, the value, the scrap value of normal loss is $1 per unit. So it means that the cost of normal loss is 205, and we need to find out the value of abnormal gain and good output and closing work in process. And you remember from previous lecture that abnormal gain value and the good output value of per unit should be same. So the per unit cost of good output and the per unit cost of abnormal gain value will be same. So first we make our statement of equivalent units. So in statement of equivalent units, we have got finished outputs, which is 2015 units, and they are 100% complete with respect to material, and that is why we call them finished units, because finished units, all material, all labor and all overheads are finished. So all of them will be 100% finished. Normal loss, as before, you subtract it only from your and then you've got normal loss of 205 units, and you have closing work in process, which is 80 units. And this closing work in process is, it will be given to you in exam that it is 100% finished with respect to material, so you write down 80 here. With respect to labor, they are only 60% complete, so 80 multiplied by 60%, it gives you 48. And then you've got 60% completion with respect to overheads, so you also add here 48. So abnormal gain units, you had 200, you subtract them, because this is what we did before in our T account as well. So abnormal gain is 200 units, and we subtract it from material as well, and labor and overhead. So now what you have, you've got 2100 units here, and 1895 units of material, 1863 units of labor, and 1863 units of overhead. This was your statement of equivalent units. Now you need to calculate cost per equivalent unit. Cost per equivalent unit, you have to find out what was the cost of 50 units, which was your opening work is process. You remember that was $727 for 50 units in opening inventory. So when you make a total of these three numbers, it will be $727. And then you input cost, your input costs were material, labor and overhead. And here you should subtract the scrap value of normal loss, like before we also did it, the scrap value of normal loss, because your normal loss was 205 units and each unit was $1, so you subtract 205 from material cost. So now this is your final material cost and your labor cost and your overhead. You divide it with the equivalent units which you just created, 1895 for material, 1863 for labor and overhead, and here you get cost per equivalent unit, which is 11.83, 8.97 and 4.98. This is your cost per equivalent unit. So it means that the total cost per equivalent unit is $25.78. And then we go forward, we do our valuation, our finished output. We said finished output is 2015 units at $25.78, which is $51,947. and then our closing work in process with respect to material, it was 80 units because we had in 80 units in our closing work in process, and they were 100% finished with respect to material. So 80 units multiplied by 100%, 80 equivalent units, and 1 unit equivalent cost for material is 11.83. You multiply it. For labor and overheads, you were 60% completed work. So 80 units multiplied by 60%, there were 48 equivalent units for labor, each valuing 8.97. So this is your labor cost for closing work in process. And for overhead, again there were 48 units, and the overhead cost in one equivalent unit is 4.98. So it gives you 239. Here you calculate your value of closing work in process as 1616, and then you go and complete your abnormal gain thing. Abnormal gain, we said that abnormal loss, abnormal gain, they are valued at the good output value. So your good output was 25.78, and the same value you assign to your abnormal gain. So your abnormal gain was 5156, and then we will add them into our process account. And you remember that we had left these abnormal gain, good output, and normal loss, work in process closing. We add them here. 51947 is my good output, and then your closing work in process is 1616, and your abnormal gain, which is again you are valuing with the good output value, it was 5156. You complete your ledger account and both sides will be equal. So now in the previous example we calculated opening work in process, closing work in process. In this example we took that opening work in process and we had closing work in process both. So this is now this T account, this process account, this ledger account, it is a complete reflection of your process costing, in which you have opening work in process, in which you have closing work in process, you have normal loss, and you have abnormal gain. If we had some abnormal loss, we would have put it here on the right side. So summary and question approach, how do you do it? The rule is, first you need to calculate the flow of units. How many units are input, how much is good output, how much is normal loss, abnormal loss, or probably some opening work in process units and closing work in process units. Fill in process account as far as possible. As far as possible means that you add on the left side material, labor, overhead. You write down the value or cost of normal loss, which is usually given in exam question, and then you need to further calculate your cost of good output. Working statement of equivalent unit. First produce your statement of equivalent unit, then you make your cost per equivalent unit, and then you valuation you complete into the process account. So it is a little bit long, but once you do 4 or 5 questions, it is very simple, because there is a particular sequence of it's a particular sequence of events which you must perform. And once you do it systematically, step by step, it should not be very difficult. It just needs to do 4, 5 or 6 questions.